I'm not going to answer the question.
Why
because,
would you answer that
because
question?
the question is,
you want to put a lot of
the
new
question
Supreme Court
is,
justice,
the
radical
question,
left.
Will you shut up, man?
Listen.
Have you ever felt as though US election debates were nothing more than a giant waste of time? Why don't they ever get down to the really important issues? Why don't they ever talk about the root causes behind the country's deepest problems? Why does the entire debate seem to come down to just a few hot-button topics that don't really deal with the biggest problems that the country faces? It's because the powerful people who run the debates want it that way. They don't want the American people discussing or even thinking about topics like why their healthcare costs so much, why the entirety of the mainstream media is controlled by just 6 companies, why they have absolutely no say on which wars their country gets involved with, why nobody seems to be doing anything about the massive homelessness crisis that grows worse every single day, why giant corporations are still able to lobby the government to get what they want. You see, political issues can be split into 2 categories. 1, systemic issues. 2, transient issues. Systemic issues call into question whether the system itself works for the American people or not. For example, should the way elections are run be changed? Should the American people get to vote on whether their country goes to war or not? Should Big Pharma be allowed to profit off of people suffering? Transient issues are issues that come and go with the times. For example, what a particular politician said in their latest tweet, a recent tragic event that took place like a mass shooting or a terrorist attack, a lie that a particular politician may or may not have said. Pay attention to any US electoral debate today and notice how almost all of the topics of discussion are transient issues and not systemic issues. Why is that? Well, because the Commission of Presidential Debates controls which questions are asked, who the moderator is, and which audience members are allowed to ask questions. The tightly controlled questions are asked. The politicians on stage then answer these tightly controlled questions. The public discusses the answers to these tightly controlled questions amongst each other. And the answers to these tightly controlled questions are shared throughout social media. And at no point along the way have systemic issues been discussed, not even amongst the watching public. Americans think that they're having a lively debate amongst each other, when in fact the framework of the debate was chosen for them beforehand. US electoral debates today are tightly controlled to make sure that the American public does not start discussing ideas that may negatively affect the profits of the giant corporations and powerful interests that actually run the country. Every 4 years, the American people watch a giant lie play out right in front of their faces, and they do nothing about it. TV election debates are not free and open debates where anything can be discussed. Instead, they're tightly controlled environments whereby the debates are strictly limited to an incredibly small number of topics. But it wasn't always this way. Once upon a time, the US actually had free and open TV election debates. But then, in 1988, everything changed. Let me tell you about the League of Women Voters. You see, US election debates were originally established by a group called the League of Women Voters. This was a non-partisan group with the goal of creating free and open debates between presidential candidates in front of television cameras so that the American people could get a real sense of exactly who they were voting for. The League of Women Voters had no ties to any particular political parties and no ties to giant corporations. They were the perfect impartial sponsor for the US election debates. Then in 1988, it all changed. Both the Republicans and the Democrats started making conditions for joining the debates. Here is some of the demands that they made. They wanted to decide what the TV cameras showed. The press had to be in the last 2 rows at the back of the seating areas. They wanted to choose who was in the audience at the debates. They wanted to decide who would ask the questions and how they would be asked. In 1988, the League of Women Voters withdrew its sponsorship from the presidential debates.
Under these circumstances, the League is withdrawing its sponsorship of the presidential debates scheduled for mid-October in Los Angeles.
after George H.W. Bush and Michael Dukakis campaigns secretly agreed to a memorial of understanding that, quote, would decide which candidates could participate in the debates, which individuals would be panelists and therefore able to ask questions, and even the height of the lecterns. As the League of Women Voters withdrew its sponsorship from the US debates, they left one last message, and that was,
The League of Women Voters is announcing today that we have no intention of becoming an accessory to the hoodwinking of the American public.
And ever since the League of Women stepped down as the sponsor for the US electoral debates, the American public has been hoodwinked in exactly the way that the League of Women Voters feared. Today, US electoral debates are tightly controlled environments. The audience submits their questions beforehand. Audience members are allowed to ask one question, and then their microphone will be switched off. Audience members during the US debates are not a random selection of people. Instead, they are chosen carefully. Usually, the audience is made up of the wealthy donor class and not ordinary Americans. The choice of moderator is controlled. All of the questions asked to each candidate are controlled. The positions of each podium are controlled. After all, those podiums placed in the center are more likely to be viewed as legitimate candidates compared to those placed at the ends. You see, the problem with live debates is that they're risky for the candidates. The presidential candidate isn't able to consult with their advisors and make statements based on market research. Instead, they have to think of their answers on the spot and risk accidentally saying something that will damage their reputation in the eyes of the American public. They aren't able to present a well-polished version of themselves. Instead, in a live debate, the public can get a sense of the true personality of each candidate. Candidates don't want to deal with any of that, particularly for presidential candidates who are already in power. They'd be much happier to avoid live TV debates altogether. They would much rather have experts carefully craft a perfect image of them and distribute it to the public in a social media post or a television ad. Those pesky live debates, hosted by the League of Women Voters, were quite the nuisance for powerful people who wanted to carefully control which president was voted into power. So they created a plan to control the debates themselves, and they very much succeeded in doing so. So the US electoral debates are a complete sham, run and controlled by giant corporations. But the thing is, we don't need giant corporations to set up presidential debates anymore. We have the power to make them ourselves. Why doesn't somebody create their own fair, impartial presidential debates on the internet? Host lesser-known candidates. Give them plenty of time to speak. Don't let anybody control which questions are asked. Don't let anybody choose who moderates the debate. Let every single American get to know the true personality of every presidential candidate by forcing them to answer difficult questions on the spot, live. Stop allowing presidential candidates to hide away from questions. Remember, the media doesn't tell you what to think. The media tells you what to think about.